Today I'm going to try something almost impossible. I'm going to explain Tenet.
You let Sador get hold of 241?
No, I let him get a hold of the algorithm. So tell me about it, Priya.
It's unique. The scientist who built it took her own life so she couldn't be forced to make another.
A scientist in the future.
Generations from now.
Why does she have to kill herself?
You're familiar with the Manhattan Project? As they approached the first atomic test, Oppenheimer became concerned that the detonation might produce a chain reaction engulfing the world.
They went ahead anyway and got lucky.
Think of our scientist as her generation's Oppenheimer. She devises a method for inverting the world, but becomes convinced that by destroying us, they're destroying themselves.
The grandfather paradox.
But unlike Oppenheimer, she rebels, splitting the algorithm into 9 sections and hiding them the best place she can think of.
The past. Here, now.
Don't try to understand it. Feel it.
So for me, when I attempt to describe what Tenet is, I got the movie in the sense, I don't remember which character says this, but they say, we are constantly communicating with the future. Credit cards, banking systems, and media all tell the future about the past. But what happens if the future communicates with the past? The world becomes invaded. Right?
Got it.
Right. So for me, when I watched Tenet the first time, I didn't get confused as much because I had watched another movie called Predestination.
It can be overwhelming, knowing the future.
So what, you're a cop?
I'm a temporal agent. We prevent crime before it takes place.
What is it?
It's a time machine.
In that movie, what essentially happens is this guy goes back in time and he becomes a transgender. He gives birth to himself, somehow controlling time. So when I watched Tenet, it sort of reminded me of Predestination. So I watched it from that perspective. We need to define certain words when it comes to Tenet. The first word that we need to define is, what does the word invert mean? So according to Webster, to invert is to reverse the position, order, or relationship, to turn inside out or upside down. However, we also have to remember that what we're watching is actually a movie. So the movies tend to have their own definitions. In Tenet, inversion in Tenet means certain elements are flowing backwards through time. Their trajectory has become inverted. That's not to say free will is non-existent because the instinct drives the momentum of the object. This is made possible because someone in the future was able to create a time machine, a turnstile that allows them to go back in time, but the result of that is time flowing backwards. So in essence, you have to keep this in mind, what inversion is. So according to Webster, inversion is to reverse the position, order, or relationship, to turn outside. So this is the key part of the whole movie, is that when we first see the protagonist, he sees that inverted bullet at the opera house. That's the first time we're introduced to the movie. That's the first scene. But the one thing that I've learned with Christopher Nolan movies is the first scene doesn't necessarily mean that's the beginning of the movie. If you remember, there's this famous YouTube video of his where he was describing how he wrote Memento. And I think that it's not just how he wrote Memento, it's essentially how he writes his movies. So he doesn't start the movie from the beginning, he doesn't end the movie in the middle. It's weird. It's a Christopher Nolan way of doing it.
What's the best way to draw it? The best way to draw it is as a hairpin, like that. That's basically the end of the movie. And this is running backwards as a series of jumps. And what we do is we cut between the two the whole way through. So we alternate scene here, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, and they meet towards the end of the film. But then within this, you have flashbacks to a different timeline, which is actually even earlier, somewhere around there. Also within this, you have flashbacks to an earlier time, also somewhere within there. So I guess you could use the hairpin shape to represent the bulk of the film.
right. So we first started the opera scene. If you've watched the entire movie, you know this is a critical scene because this is where he gets the part of the algorithm from the protagonist. But from the beginning of the movie, we have no idea what's going on, what type of heist is going on, and that Seta essentially is the villain in this movie, what he's doing there. So we do not know this, but we just start in the middle of a heist. And then the movie starts to move forward from there. And then because when we watch anything, we move in a linear direction, but we are watching. So I think one of the challenges that Tenet has, not challenges, but one of the what makes Tenet special is how it's directed. So it's not written in a linear form. You know, when you watch a Quentin Tarantino movie, you know that the story is unfolding. You're slowly understanding that A leads to B, and then B leads to C to D. When you're watching a Christopher Nolan movie, it's you start at Z. So A and Z, you start at A and Z. Scene A takes you to scene Z, or we start at the end, and then it's all mumbo jumbo. So with Christopher Nolan, it's more of we're solving a puzzle rather than an unwinding story. So what happens is we start with the heist, and then from the heist, rather than the movie flowing to that the next scene essentially is why were we doing the heist, the movie then moves to a different direction. We see the protagonist eat the cyanide, and then because he thinks this will kill him, and then rather than him dying, he wakes up in a coma being taken to a different space where he starts to learn about this thing called Tenet, where then that's where us, the audience, are introduced to Tenet. But in that key, there's key information that's passed to the audience to understand what we're actually watching, because that's where that gentleman tells them there's an organization, it uses the word Tenet, which opens good or bad doors. That's the only information we have. However, for us as an audience, we are watching the movie in a linear way. So for us, the story is slowly unfolding. However, for the main character, the protagonist, the story is not unfolding as we are watching it. Because for the protagonist in this instance, he is not in the right timeline. So that timeline is for us to understand his storyline, right? So he goes and then he starts to learn about the inverted bullets, in which I feel that scene was placed by Christopher Nolan as a way of talking to the audience to say, do not try to understand this movie at this part. That's where the inverted bullets come from, because now he's giving you the exposition and he's essentially giving us the theme of the movie. When it comes to, like, if you're a screenwriter and people like that, like at this part, he's giving us what the theme of the movie is. It's all going to be about inversion, which is a little bit complicated because if you've not read or like researched what the word invert means, then the movie will just pass by you and you're in the cinema trying to enjoy. So Christopher Nolan essentially says, hey, don't try to understand.
It's a type of inverse radiation triggered by nuclear fission.
Great movies, what they do is they make the audience work, but we don't realize we're working. And I think that a lot of us, because with the style of movies or storytelling that we are used to this day, is we're used to being spoon-fed the entire story. Whilst with Tenet, it tends not to follow that direction. Now, I need you to understand this part. The granddad theory. The granddad theory is that if you go back in time and kill your grandpa, does that wipe you out of existence? There's a chance that it does not, because what happened. Then you could go back and kill your granddad and nothing happens to you. This is a complex thing that a lot of movies have tried to explain. If you've watched DC movies, I know that in The Flash, Barry always wanted to go back and save his mother, his parents, and he never could, because if he did, that would mess up with the timeline. I'll try to break down for you guys the plot of Tenet. The future has become uninhabitable. In order to make it habitable, the future tries to nuke its past and reset the planet. Essentially, this is the motivation of the antagonist in Tenet, the villain. So how you have to look at it is think about Avengers. I'd like to bring up Avengers. Thanos, when Thanos starts in Infinity War, he has a mission. His goal is essentially to bring balance to the world, right? So what he does is he does everything that he can to bring back balance to the world. He believes this is destiny. This is his mission. And how he goes about doing that, whether you agree with it or not, is motivated. He is motivated to achieve this. For him, he's morally driven to do this.
Titan was like most planets. Too many mouths, not enough to go around. And when we faced extinction, I offered a solution.
Genocide.
random, dispassionate fare to rich and poor alike. They called me a madman. And what I predicted came to pass. With all 6 stones, I could simply snap my fingers. They would all cease to exist, and I call that mercy.
And then what?
I finally rest and watch the sunrise on a grateful universe. The hardest choices require the strongest wills.
And this is what happens a lot of times with a lot of villains. It's they all feel they have a strong reason to do what they do. They're not driven by the need of money. They're not driven by anything. So what you have in Tenet is you have people in the future who are living in an uninhabitable planet who want to fix it. And the only way they know how to fix it is essentially by stopping the people in the present, who is us, from who is in the present or in the past. So we, the audience, are in the present, but the people in the future want to nuke the present, right? So that's the antagonist. His or her belief is that if we destroy the past, then we create a future. You have a crazy villain who's willing to take a chance and destroy the whole earth and make the future habitable. So for me, I believe that the true villain in Tenet is Priya Singh. She is the antagonist. And you know, there's a lot of times like when people do the breakdown, they're like, she was rude to the protagonist. She didn't treat him with fear or anything. And that's my belief, that these two know each other from the future. However, they are constantly in this battle in the past. So she, for me, is the main villain. And I think what Nolan does in this instance is just give you the typical villain who's a drugs dealer, arms dealer in any movie, but makes her so feminine that we don't really pay attention to what's happening and seeing the danger. And we trust her to think that she's in Tenet and that she's part of it. But remember, in the second scene when he's on the boat, that guy tells him the word Tenet will open good doors and it will also open bad doors. Priya tells him Seda now has all 9 pieces of algorithm, a device that future antagonists need to invert the entropy of the world and destroy its past. She planned for Seda to get the artifacts so as to reveal to the other 8 pieces in preparing his dead drop. Based on his earlier conversation with Crosby, the protagonist realizes it's a nuclear hypocenter detonated on the 14th in Seda's hometown of Stausk. What is entropy? Entropy is simply a measure of disorder, and it affects all aspects of our daily lives. In fact, you can think of it as nature's tax. Left unchecked, disorder increases over time. Energy disperses and systems dissolve into chaos. The more disordered something is, the more entropic we consider it. In short, we can define entropy as a measure of disorder of the universe on both the macro and the microscopic level. The algorithm allows this. Tenet is about a secret agent that is given a single word as his weapon and sent to prevent the onset of World War III. He must travel through time and bend the laws of nature in order to be successful in his mission. Knowing what we know about World War II with the atomic bomb, imagine if you could go back in time and avoid that. But rather than just nuking Nagasaki, imagine if you could nuke the globe, a fear most of us hold when it comes to World War III. Okay, so with Tenet, you have to think of it you have to break it down for yourself and then put it in a linear perspective. So you essentially have pieces to a puzzle, and that puzzle is something that you have to solve. Remember, if you've heard about World War II, how World War II ended when essentially Hiroshima and Nagasaki were nuked, the impacts of that, right? Where the impact of that is we now know. So us in the future know what happens when the atomic bombs were dropped.
They won't fear it until they understand it. And they won't understand it until they've used it.
We know the effects, we know everything that happened. However, imagine if you had a device that could reverse that thing happening. So that's essentially entropy. So imagine if what Tenet tries to explain and why this movie exists is, imagine the things that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were opposite. So if in the past the earth was uninhabitable, so if in the past Hiroshima and Nagasaki was something that happened in the past, however, moving forward, we don't have that. We don't have that experience. This is something that the algorithm does and allows us to do. So it just allows you to reset Earth. The world would be like it was before the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the past would be the present day. So the algorithm essentially allows you to reverse time. Hence, the future becomes the past and the past the future. And because of free will, the only constant is the humans. But because everything is nuked, there's no trace of the past. Everything began with a Big Bang. So if you remember, what I think inspires this whole story is the Big Bang theory. So isn't they say the world started with a Big Bang? That's the whole concept behind Seto's motivation. His belief is he's already dying, and if he's dying, he wants to die with everybody. I read a part where it says Seto is omnicidal. So what Seto does is, his belief is, well, I'm dying regardless. So with my death, I will then nuke the world and kill essentially everybody. And when he does that, what that does, it creates the Big Bang, which essentially ends our timeline. So us as the audience, it ends our timeline. And with our timeline wiped out of existence, the future because of the algorithm, rather than the future being uninhabitable, the things are reversed. So the future is what's getting, because of the algorithm, the future is what's getting nuked. And then the past goes to the future, and essentially we disappear from existence.
Well, they're trying to destroy the world.
I'm not done creating a new one. Somewhere, sometime, a man in a crystalline tower throws a switch, and Armageddon is both triggered and avoided. Not time itself switches direction. The same sunshine we bask in will warm the faces of our descendants generations to come.
How could they want to kill us?
Because their oceans rose and their rivers ran dry. Don't you see? They have no choice but to turn back. We're responsible.
So these people who are in the future who do not exist. And that's the other thing with Christopher Nolan, where you have to have followed his career. If you watch Dunkirk, in Dunkirk, they were essentially fighting the German soldiers who did not exist. So they were essentially fighting an antagonist that's never on screen. That's the same thing. Right now, we're fighting a future war with people who are not on screen, who we just speak about.
Save them. Who's they?
Juicy will return to a happy moment on a family vacation in Vietnam that was also on the 14th and commit suicide, sending the dead drop coordinates to the future via a dead man's switch. Arriving at the 14th, Kate goes to Vietnam to pause as a past and keep Sarah alive until the Tenet forces in Stask 12 recover the algorithm. They use the Temporal Pincer movement with both non-invaded and invaded troops making a diversionary attack, so the protagonist and Ives can discreetly steal the algorithm before detonation. One of Sarah's men, Volkov, traps them in the hypocenter, and Sarah calls from Vietnam to explain that the antagonists are trying to escape the effects of climate change. So essentially, that's the premise of the movie, is the future is uninhabitable because of climate change, and in order to fix it, you just nuke the present, and then that makes the future more habitable, which is essentially the same thing that Thanos was trying to do in Avengers, but in a different way. These guys are actually going to bring Armageddon. That made me be convinced that Priya Singh is the villain in this whole thing. Is at the end when she tries, and with the Christopher Nolan movie, you have to understand the end is not the end. The whole thing is not written in a linear timeline, as is constantly explained in the movie. Priya Singh is essentially the villain in this movie. Is when she says at the end, when she says to the protagonist, I'm here to cut down loose ends, and she tries to kill Kat. The part is that the protagonist realizes who the actual antagonist is. Without Kat, the protagonist has no access to Seda and does not stop the villain's plan. So she has to die. She is the loose end, but for the protagonist, Priya is the loose end. But remember, the Temporal Pincer, Priya is not dead, just like Neo is not dead, but in a certain timeline, they both are. So what essentially is happening is the reason Priya wanted Kat to die is if she kills Kat, that means the protagonist has no access to Seta and has no access to the information. So Kat is the one that holds the thread to this. It's not a romantic relationship, but because of her, they have access to Seta. So if you take away Kat, the protagonist has no access to Seta, because in his loop, everything flows through Kat. So if you take away Kat, Seta goes through with his plan, and then the Big Bang happens. So this is why the protagonist says, I am the protagonist, and Priya is the antagonist. Hence, he shoots her. So in that instance is, you are the villain, I am the hero. That's the story. What I feel, one thing about Christopher Nolan movies I've learned is the stories don't move in a linear way, which you're constantly told. So in the end, it's not really the end, and it's the middle, and the beginning is the end. It's weird. The movie is essentially a loop created by the protagonist in the future to help save the past. Only people who use the word Tenet actually know what's going on. To the rest of the world, what happens in Tenet is what could have happened, but what was prevented, and we don't know because it's a spy movie, and spies save the world without us knowing. Hence, don't try to understand it. Feel it. It's the same thing that happens with Bond movies. Like, you cannot believe what's happening in a Bond movie that it actually happens, that the world is saved from an almost something happening, but then it never happens. So us as a society, we never really get to experience that activity. That's the same thing with Tenet. It's just somewhere out there are people moving back and forwards in time, and they're saving the world from essentially Armageddon, and we do not know this. So in a movie, we never get to see the characters pay the taxi or eat or sleep. In Dunkirk, we never saw the Germans. In Tenet, we don't get to see the villain or the organization Tenet. And the ethos, like in movies like 007 with MI6 or the Bond movies with the CIA. The movie, so we don't get to see these things, which is also a little bit confusing, because in a lot of movies, we get to see the organization. So we would have seen what Tenet is, what this organization, why it was established, what it stands for, and how it's trying to save the world. Then that gives us a way to move forward with the movie with an understanding. Whereas in this time, we don't get that. We don't get to see the organization. We don't get to see what they step. We just get to be part of a mission. But then we get lost within the time loops. The movie sort of begins at the end, and the ending is essentially at the beginning. How the protagonist got the algorithm in his hands. The movie is not linear. It's all a timeless classic. All right. So the main thing with Tenet that I understood is when we are watching it, we are introduced to the protagonist, and then we move with him and we learn about inverted bullets. But at a certain point, it clicks in him that he can manipulate time. So he starts moving backwards in time and forwards in time. So if you remember, there's a part where he's walking with Priya. The part where he's like, 2 days from now, you're going to tell me something, which essentially is him giving Seta the algorithm. And then by giving Seta the algorithm, he essentially is the reason how Seta gets the whole algorithm, the whole parts of the algorithm. However, the thing that happens is for Priya, she wants him to have the other 9. So by having the first one, he eventually gets all 9. So then she tells him that the man is in communication with the future. Somebody who's in the future comes and does deals with him. But who can it be? So for me, that's where my belief is. It's her. She is the one who comes back into the past. She is the one responsible for this. Because for her, she probably has the conviction that we have to nuke the past because what's happened has happened and all that stuff that they keep saying in the movie. But what then happens is we have different time zones or timelines of the protagonist, and you have to be paying attention to understand at which part he is. Because every time he leaves Neo and goes off camera, a lot of times he's going back in time or forward in time. So he has an understanding of how to bend time. And for us as an audience, this is never explained to say he's moved out of time. So as we are watching, if you remember the heist scene with the fire truck, how that works is they essentially go to try to steal his part of the algorithm. And when he steals it in real time, right, Seta comes back because Seta has watched this part in future and in his past. And the thing that's happening in this very moment is, as the audience, we are experiencing this for the first time. But for Seda, it's the future Seda has experienced this, the past Seda is experiencing it. So they're studying that moment, because in that moment, if they're capable of taking the algorithm, then he has the whole thing that he needs. So he's done this multiple times, and because they're in this timeline loop, it's something that happens over and over and over and over and over and over. It doesn't stop happening over and over and over again. Those activities happen. Seta is killed by Cat. Remember, when Cat explains to the protagonist that I saw a woman jump out of a boat, she was free and I envied her freedom.
And when we got back, I glimpsed some other woman diving off the boat and he'd vanished. I never felt such envy.
If you remember that part, that was Kate in the present moving forward. However, she doesn't realize that that's Kate from the future who came back, who is her. So that then means the future can communicate with the past, but we're still moving forward. So the timeline, so we're in different timelines moving forward. But the Kate that killed Seda, when she comes back, because Seda is still alive in the present moment, hence what's happened is happened. So what she does, the Kate from the future who comes back to kill Seda in the present on the 14th on his happy day. Man, this movie is ridiculous. Who kills Seda the present day is essentially Seda is not essentially dead, because this is Seda from the future. Okay, back to the past. So the movie is, for me, essentially what Tenet is. It's a loophole of time. And if you've watched a lot of time-based movies, I always talk about messing up with the timeline, making sure you don't interact with your past, because this messes up with the timeline. And what I feel in Tenet happens is what actually happens when you messes with the timeline. So we start to see items such as when the protagonist is fighting himself. In those instances, in most movies, that's not supposed to happen. Future you is not supposed to be in contact with past you, which we see when the protagonist fights with Neo, and then Neo lets him go, and the protagonist is like, you let me go and you knew, how come you didn't tell me? So we are essentially in a loop. The whole movie is essentially a timeline loop, which is ridiculous when you think about it. But you just have to follow the whole movie. It's not confusing. It's a little bit confusing. It's a puzzle. It's not a, what do you call it? It's not a Quentin Tarantino movie which is flowing forward. It's going forward, comes back, it goes up, it comes down. It just moves in a jumble. It's a puzzle. So always bear that in mind. Tenet is a puzzle. It's not something that you're supposed to watch and be like, I get it. Anyway, that's my best attempt at explaining this movie. Let me know in the comment section what your thoughts are. It's been on my mind for the past 2 years, and I feel like I understood what was going on. In essence, those guys are just in a loop stopping World War III that doesn't end. And for many years, I don't even think they die as well, because they can die in one timeline and then reappear in the next one. So it's just a essentially ongoing loop, whereby I think in another reality, the bomb goes, and that's how we have the Big Bang Theory. Let me know what you think in the comment section. I feel like Tenet is gonna be a timeless classic. That's a timeless classic. And with Oppenheimer coming, who knows what Christopher Nolan is going to do to our minds. Anyway, it's been nice hanging out with you guys. I'll definitely see you in the next one.
Not going back to London to check on Kat, are you?
No, it's far too dangerous.
Even from afar?
Even from afar.
Ives! Wait!
You're really going back in?
I'm the only one who could have got that door open in time, right, Ives?
I don't know any locksmiths as good as you.
See? It's me in there again.
Weaving another pass in the fabric of this mission.
Neil, wait!
Just save the world. Can't leave anything to chance.
But can we change things if we do it differently?
What's happened's happened. Which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world. It's not an excuse to do nothing.
Fate?
Call it what you want.
What do you call it?
Reality. Now let me go.
Hey, you never did tell me who recruited you, Neil.
Haven't you guessed by now? You did. Only not when you thought. You have a future in the past. Years ago for me, years from now for you.
You've known me for years.
For me, I think this is the end of a beautiful friendship.
But for me, it's just the beginning.
We get up to some stuff. You're gonna love it. You'll see. This whole operation's a temporal pincer.
Whose?
Yours! You're only halfway there. I'll see you at the beginning, friend. We're the people saving the world from what might have been. The world would never know what could have happened. And even if they did, they wouldn't care. So no one cares about the bomb that didn't go off. Only the one that did.
Do it before the boy comes out.
That's your idea of mercy. You gave me your word.
And I told you then what it would be worth. Yeah. Today. How did you know?
Cannon Place, 3 o'clock. Probably Nottingham.
Posterity.
Cannon Place, 3 o'clock. Probably Nottingham.
I told you you'd have to start looking differently at the world.
I have to tie up the loose ends.
That was gonna be your job.
Then whose was it?
Mine. I realized I wasn't working for you. We've both been working for me. I'm the protagonist.
Then you'd better tie up those loose ends.